Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Colleen. Again, thank you, Lidos. I get to moderate this panel because everybody knows this is like my favorite. You know, Kathy, those 30 security clearance questions are absolutely my jam. And so I'm so glad to have this panel here. And as you can tell, they represent diverse viewpoints around this issue. We have ODNI, we have RAND, we have somebody who's in DOD and also just has her own amazingness that she's doing to support the federal workforce. And I think that, again, it's a perfect segue to exactly what we talked about before and what we want to talk about now, which is, you know, what are some of the barriers specific to the security clearance process that might be preventing us from attracting the best talent? So again, it's clearance myth busting. I just want to start with, kind of by way of introduction for all of you, have you give me, what do you think are some of the myths about working in national security careers? I always throw government under the bus first, so I'm sorry, Xavier, you get to set the stage.
Not a problem. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Xavier Clark. So I think a big myth that we in the government, we tend to have is that you have to be perfect to hold a clearance, especially at the TS SCI level. And I think that leads us to be giving out misinformation to the populations that we're reaching out to. In a lot of cases, especially when a person has a medical device, or they are from a minoritized community, or they are from have smoked weed, let's just be honest, in their life, that meaning that they can never hold a security clearance. And I think it's incumbent upon us as recruitment and talent acquisition professionals to ensure that those myths are a part of the conversation, and it's not something we shy away from, but embrace as we help to break some of those myths. So.
And then again, you gotta go next, Love. So kind
Sure.
of what do you think are some of the myths preventing people from like pursuing federal government careers? Somebody who advocates so well for the federal workforce.
Yeah, I think there are a few things. One, if you have had any sort of mental health issues in your past, that will bar you from getting a clearance, which obviously isn't true. And we try to encourage folks to get the treatment and the support that they need if they are experiencing issues in that area. And also, I think a lot of folks don't understand the monetary value of having a security clearance. I know a lot of you know it very well and are trying to recruit people and pay them a premium because they hold a clearance. Obviously on the government side, I can't pay you more because you're cleared, but that's something I think everyone in this room should be helping advocate for in terms of policy change. So I'm gonna get my plug in for that. Whether you're in private industry or within government, we all need to be advocating for civil service reform to be able to pay people more, not only for their clearances, but for their AI skills and some of the other things that you heard earlier today.
Now, Sina.
Hi, everyone. Sina Beaghley, and yes, I'm at RAND. This is one of my favorite research topics, so I love chatting about this, and I appreciate being here. For me, I would say, similar to what Xavier said, it's the can't have sort of mindset, right? Can't have drug use in your background, can't have family members overseas, can't have mental health episodes. And so it gets to that whole person concept, as so many of you know, and the mitigating factors. So I think people just understanding that, so that's not a deterrent from going through the process. And in fact, just even the statistic can be a little misleading, but the statistic, you know, like 1% of those that actually go through the entirety of the process ultimately are adjudicated negatively, right? So that's actually a whole lot of people that get through. It's a whole other piece of that. Well, how many leave before they get to that point? How many are tired of waiting for those flags to be cleared and that type of thing? But I think the other piece that I would just add is, so we did a study on misperceptions online. RAND did a study. The government funded it and wanted to know, hey, what are some of those key misperceptions that are out there? And one of the big things that we found is, one, the government information is accurate and fulsome, a little too fulsome, a little too comprehensive, and very hard to understand. So to get people to kind of have the information that they need is a challenge. So then they go to other sources. They go to things like the Clearance Jobs blog and other places for information. But even then, the information's maybe not necessarily false that people are throwing out there, but it might be misleading, right? You might have an investigator be like, oh, you've done that? Good luck getting your clearance, and someone else reads that and that type of thing. So, so I do think there is sort of some policy prescription here too, where in addition to cleared professionals, recruiters, et cetera, trying to offer good advice, the government can do a little bit better in making the process understandable and accessible to kind of mitigate those myths and misperceptions.
Well, that's one of my favorite, taglines to say is that the whole person concept applies. So anytime anybody's saying you can't get a clearance for this, and this, unless you are a current active drug user, and that might change soon, people, but unless like right now, that is the only instance where waivers, conditions,
Right.
All again, those wonky clearance terms, there's applications there around those. So I think the more we can talk about that, the better. So now we've talked about myths. We're in a room full of tacticians on the front lines of this process. So I also want to go back to and say, from your vantage, what advice, feedback would you say? How can we change the narrative on this and say, hey, you should pursue a national security career. You want to do this. And start with you, Love.
Sure. I think, again, getting back to myths, that there is a myth out there that people don't want to work for the government. Again, too politicized, the pay isn't high enough. But I was on the staff of the Chief Talent Management Officer for the Department of Defense. And quick reminder, I'm speaking on my own behalf now and not on behalf of the federal government. I want to throw that out there. But the DoD's Chief Talent Management Officer was doing some really interesting work with third-party intermediaries to bring in talent. And one of the myths that we busted internally was that, nobody wants to apply, nobody's interested, because we got thousands and thousands of applicants when we were using third-party intermediaries to do the recruiting. Because we're notoriously bad at recruiting in the federal government. We don't have time for it. Individual hiring managers don't want to do it because they're focused on the mission. It's collateral duty, yada, 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 right? All of you guys know this better than I do. And so, again, people want to work for the federal government. They want to support a powerful mission and feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. And so figuring out how we can leverage that kind of narrative and appeal to people who do want to tackle big challenges and understand that everything in the government isn't politicized. There are a lot of hard problems that we need to get after with skilled talent that won't get them, doxxed and won't get them stalked. So there's so many great jobs out there that are focused on important missions. So helping get that narrative out is important.
Yeah, so I would say there's two things. First, from a data perspective, and then also from a community relations perspective. From a data perspective, so my office, Office of Intelligence Analysis, but the ICDEI team, we have the annual demographic report. So this report is a comprehensive report to look at the life cycle of an employee. This is a congressional report that we send out every year. And a thing that we are looking at is it actually that we're not recruiting the right people? Are they falling out in the process? And how can you as recruiters be doing research and having a better insight into where are people falling out? So if it is that they're falling out after the polygraph, or they're falling out after they have to do the SF-86 or whatever, then you have more data to go to those communities and have a discussion when you're recruiting them. But then on the community relations side too, is meeting people where they are. I think especially for me, I am from a rural state, I'm from Texas. I did not know about the IC for most of my life until I got here for my master's program. And so when you're going to schools, you're going to spaces, these non-traditional spaces at times, it's having discussions with them to understand what things are they coming with as a bias about the government that you can help dispel. But then two, take that back so that we are not just reaching out to the same schools, same populations over and over again. We could be missing so much talent because we're only looking at certain places. So I think that is a good way for us to address that.
I love that, and you made my brain remember something I was going to talk about after Bob Sharp spoke, that we are partnering with INSA on their Common Threads events and having career events specifically with those events. So we're going to be hanging out with Bob in Charlottesville, December 4th and 5th. So join that effort. I think that's important too for you to show your companies, like, hey, if you're recruiting at Ravana Station and want to build out cleared capacities across the country, reach out to your clearance jobs team, because we are hosting career events in different locations to help you recruit geographically dispersed populations. And again, there's a lot of innovative ideas around how we can recruit cleared talent in a number of different areas. So Sina, I'm going to force you to talk about your research, which is fascinating. Like, look up her RAND studies. She is brilliant and has done so much amazing research. And I do want to give a shout out to PAC PMO for funding that, because this you can't. Things cost money, people, so you have to pay to fund that. So the government supporting that matters.
For sure.
And she's done some really brilliant work. And I know one of the great things about that research is you give recommendations around this process. So kind of talk about maybe your DIA studies or the studies or misconceptions.
Yeah.
What are some of the takeaways from those?
Yeah, so we talked about the myths one, and so the government actually is now funding, we're starting one now, a follow-on study. So that one we looked at online data sources mostly. And so now we're gonna be talking to some practitioners, right? So what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are some of the myths you're fighting? So we'll be kind of having those conversations. Also looking at generative AI, right? At that time, 3 years ago, it wasn't something people were going to for sources of information, but that is absolutely a place that people are going now. So we're going to take a look at that as far as the misperception side of things, and then offer the government really some key areas for priority focus. Where if you're going to focus on some areas, what's the biggest bang for your buck, and how can you help? So that'll be coming out probably in sometime next year. We're just kicking off that study. But on the DEIA side of things, I mean, really just on this question of equity, right, and potential for bias. And so Rand had done an exploratory study before looking at race and ethnicity and the potential for bias related to that in the security clearance process. And so the government came back to us, PAC PMO, and said, can you expand on that, look a little deeper, and talk to folks and do some research on the literature side to tell us what should we be thinking about, what are potential areas where we're not even realizing there could be equity issues in the security clearance process. So they asked us to look at race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and neurodiversity, specifically neurodivergence, right? People that have ADD, ADHD, autism, and may present differently in the security clearance process. And it was a fascinating study. Most of the individuals we talked to were personnel vetting professionals. So we talked to investigators, we talked to adjudicators, we talked to people that have been around the policy front for a long time, right? And obviously institutionally, there's no guidance that says, treat certain people certain ways, and it's intended to be an objective process. And I think that's what, every professional we talked to understood that. But in talking to individuals, there were plenty of at least anecdotal examples, right, where there was a mistreatment in this case, overwork in this case, where someone was asked a whole lot of questions that someone else with the same background but maybe a different race would not have been asked. And so there were these pieces where the government, I think, is trying to get its hands around those areas, and just do better in ensuring it's an equitable experience. So some people are gonna have a longer process, some people are gonna have to ask more questions, but kind of recognizing that person's lived experience and recognizing that that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect in the process. And so thinking about how to do that a little better through the security clearance process. So we did have a few recommendations. One of them pertained to training. So investigators, adjudicators, recognizing cultural awareness training and just kind of where people's different backgrounds are, right? We're not saying, judge someone's risk factor any differently based on their race, their gender, their sexual identity, but recognize that an investigator who's dealing with an individual should at least have enough awareness of what that individual may be facing or may be going through, and just have that as part of the training. It's a human interaction. And so we found that there is potential for bias or inequity in the security clearance process based on some of the questions that are asked, right? Just in general, those things are gonna end up being knowable. Someone's sexual orientation might be knowable when they list a same-sex gender spouse. Someone's previously in the SF-86, where someone's gender identity may become knowable prior, like one identity, and it was, they were born as a different sex, by the question about, serving in the selected service, right? So those are things that in the SF-86, those can kind of become knowable, and so the investigator knows that information. Whatever biases or issues they have going into an interview can manifest in a conversation. So it's training those individuals to just understand that experience, and then ultimately just looking for the government, it's having the data, right? Everything we're talking about is anecdotal because there isn't data out there that aligns these factors and these categories with the security clearance process. HR has information, at least in some cases, right? Race, ethnicity, but some of these other factors are just data that the government isn't necessarily collecting. And so I'm not saying the government should mandatorily collect that, but what we talked about is, whether someone can opt in to provide that information, where if they're willing to sort of provide that, then you can look at outcomes. You can actually start to measure, is there a disparity in the way certain individuals are being treated in the process, or ultimately their adjudicative outcomes. So I'm heartened that the government is interested in this topic, and they've now since funded another study that we're doing now on neurodiversity and neurodivergence in particular. So looking at how individuals who go through that process have certain behaviors, maybe more stressed by something like the polygraph, or even filling out the massive, confusing SF-86 form for everybody. And then if, from just a mental health, or just from a background of someone where those kind of details get really, really overwhelming, what can the government do to better the experience of those people in the process, which ultimately will better it for all of us, because who doesn't want a simpler form and understanding everything a little bit better? So that's what we're working on.
Yes, please. We'll talk about the PDU this afternoon, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold my breath. Could be like EAP. It's going to be 5 years later. I don't know. No offense, ODNI. So I do, is Ben here? Ben with Rand?
Yes, Ben Miller.
Ben Miller, if you have complaints or would like to be a part of the next study, go talk to Ben Miller. He's here for you. So I want to ask you, Xavier, kind of talk about, I think people outside of the community would probably be really surprised at all of the work ODNI is doing on this front. So even the fact that your role exists, that ODNI cares about diversity, that when they're updating the security clearance questionnaire, they are considering how it can be more inclusive to get more applicants, because again, we need all of the purple and green and yellow and blue squirrels from across the nation to get into this process. So what does your job and work entail?
Yeah, so my role, I'm the second senior accessibility officer for the intelligence community ever. And so my job is I am the strategic integrator of all 18 programs. So NSA, FBI, CIA, all of their programs report to me when it comes to accessibility. And my job is to ensure in two fronts. One, from ADA standpoint, 508 compliance, 504 compliance, that the person with disabilities, neurodivergent personnel, deaf and hard of hearing populations are taken care of. And on the other side of that, though, it is also how do we ensure that there are access to opportunities? So in our office, we're expanding the definition of accessibility to also include the pipeline and access to stories, to where you want to go in your career path and journey. In doing that, though, for example, a big project we had been working on, when I came into this role, I was very shocked. ICD 124 over electronic medical devices had been on the pipeline for 13 years. I came in my first 6 months, I said, this makes no sense, and we got it signed. It's done now. And we're working on ICSs with that, which are standards, to make sure that that's implemented. Also, on top of that, we're working on a destigmatization program. And speaking of what you're saying about the myth busting and different things of that nature and the data, is we're actually seeing that there is qualitative data in the government. As we all know, from tech backgrounds, we have a proclivity for quantitative data. And we overlook qualitative data as if that is not true or real. And so my office is doing a lot of work around how do we integrate qualitative practices into how we are looking at the identities and our ADR, for example, which tells you attrition is happening in the first year for people of color, persons with disabilities, and women, namely Black women, in their first year of being on duty. The destigmatization program is looking at, okay, cool, we know that's happening. How do we look at these populations now and work with them to tell their story and not be seen as a mission enhancer and not a mission hindrance? And so for our office also, we're doing a lot of work around making DEIA based in return on investment and also in mission. You will never hear our office come to you and talk about fluffy. DEIA matters because all of us need to get along. We all need to be friends. Obviously, you have a clearance. So our job is to have you understand, no, when you're working on transnational organized crime, for example, we are here to make you see how that is integrated into that mission set. When you're working on a GeoWint project, how does that working if you're looking at two different people in their body stature, but you're not realizing that a woman of color in that nation might be a certain person, but if you look at the commercial imagery of someone else, that was actually a male and you killed the wrong person. So it's helping us make it more tactical to see how you advance the work we're doing, not just to make it be about, oh, let's have more people that look different. We want the right talent in the room, but we can't do that if we're not having the right discussions in the room. So.
Love that. So and love you're at the pulse point of the federal workforce, both as a senior leader in this community and then as the host of the FedUpward podcast, a part of the Fed Fam. There's a lot of resources that you provide there, so thank you for all of that. And I have to ask you the critical question, so give us, what is the grade, the scale, the state of the federal workforce? I think we talk a lot about, again, the politicization of federal service. How do you view people's viewpoints of federal service from the inside?
Yeah, thank you, Lindy, for that question. And let me give a quick plug for the FedFam Facebook group. I don't run that, but it is a resource for federal employees and people who support them to just have an open platform to talk to each other about challenges that they're experiencing and issues that they're facing. And through that platform and the podcast that I run, one of the things that comes up over and over again, which seems super simplistic, but matters very much, I think, for the people in this room, is nobody wants to work for a jerk, and they're leaving jobs because their bosses are jerks, right? So we have to be very astute in seeing that happen, and recruiters should care about this, right? Because we have to re-recruit our current talent, and if they're working for jerks and we're not advocating to get those people either trained to do better and to care about culture and how they're treating people, or we need to get them out, or otherwise our great talent is going to leave. So I think that's especially important right now as we have so many different generations in the workforce, and the expectations and the mores that are appropriate for the people who are above me in the chain of command right now are extremely different from talent that's coming in fresh off the street right out of college or from private industry. And helping to manage up and across to make sure that folks who are in those very senior leadership positions understand what the expectations are now so that they can meet their mission requirements, because without people, without talent, we're not going to be able to do that. It's so important. So again, if you're in the recruitment business, you need to be paying attention to how the leadership chain in your organization is working on retention, because they're going to make your job harder if they're not getting people out who are performing poorly. And I think that comes up over and over and over again when federal employees specifically have the opportunity to speak candidly about their experiences.
I have no idea what time it is, because I broke my phone and I have a watch. Jill, anybody shut up?
10:28.
Sure, okay, thank you. Amanda keeps shouting at me, time to get off the stage. So this ties in perfectly what you said, Love, is I wanted to ask about the frozen middle, right? This is just a comment I keep talking about, Bob Sharp gets it, Wendy gets it, people at the top of the chain get it. We continue to have the twofold issue, right? We keep talking about how do we retain federal workers and diverse workers, but also people think middle management sucks at the same time. So how do we combine these two? How do we ensure the resilience? People stay in the long game who we want, but maybe how do we offload the bad ones? I don't know. Who wants to take it? It's open-ended.
I'll hop in. I have a lot of feelings about this. We call them middle managers, and I think that is already the first issue. The framing and the rhetoric we use around middle managers, they're leaders. And when we are recruiting them into this pipeline, we have to do a better job of making them understand we are not just talking around you and to you, we have to bring you into the conversation. From an analyst and collector background, when you're an operator, you go through 3 to 4 weeks of being trained, months of training. When you become a supervisor, however, at that GS 14, 15 level, or a supervisory 13, you start the day of and you don't even know how to put a reasonable accommodation in. That's a problem. And until we understand how to make the middle manager framework be shifted, that they're not the enemy, but they're also an employee that we have forgotten. And that sometimes we are making into the villain because they were not prepared to be the hero. And I think there's a lot of times those middle managers are crying out for help, but senior leadership in the employee level, we often are the two talking to each other. But the middle managers are like, hey, but what about me? And then they get casted as the bad guy or the bad woman because it is seen as that they don't care. And I think it's back to Mr. Sharp's point earlier, that caring aspect is necessary, but we have to care about them too. I would love to see us, when we're doing recruitment and we're doing these, building them up to get into the space, but how do we put leadership development trainings into place that when they are on day one, they have everything that they need? or they at least have, CIA has an amazing program. They're called Accessibility Talent Brokers. So when you come into CIA and you need a reasonable accommodation, from day one of you getting your EOD, you have a person with you the whole process. Why don't we have that for middle managers or middle leaders, as we're going to call them now? So that when we're tracking their performance, it's not just about them doing performance management and all of that. It's also that they're being effective at their jobs and supported.
I think that's so critical to leadership development. And shout out for Partnership for Public Service, who I know is here. Like, I know they have a lot of programs for the federal workforce. But it's important across the private sector too, because a common complaint across recruiters is how bad your hiring managers are, correct? So how can we better train across like what the talent ecosystem is, the reality of the workforce, like doing all of that? It all starts with training in different ways. Does anybody have questions out there? Yes.
Sina, has RAND done any studies or forecasting any studies on justice impact of people in the clearance process? Because as we look at DE&I, there are people who have justice background that have been in the criminal justice system that can be granted clearance when we put a whole person perspective. And that expands our reach on our missing 100,000 clearance workers every year.
Yeah. So the question for those that couldn't quite hear it, I think, is looking at the criminal history, right, of individuals, and whether RAND has done studies related to the criminal history and how that impacts the security clearance process, what some of those pieces are. So I don't know how much RAND has done on that specific. We've done a couple studies on criminal history vis-a-vis the security clearance process, but a lot of it has to do with records information sharing, and they've been for the government, not publicly released because of some of the sensitivity of the data that we've been able to gather. But I know RAND in general has looked at criminal history records and hiring, right? And sort of people, what that means, bringing in someone who has a background but is, sort of recidivist or, no longer is in that world, and what that means for sort of hiring and generally in their life. So I don't know how much we focus on that specific area, but just in general, it's that sort of same question of some of those mitigating circumstances, I think, when you go into the security clearance process. So when we've looked at it, it's been that bigger, broader, it's one of the categories of information that's collected.
Aaron, and then there.
It is on. So from the perspective of a transitioning veteran, I want to address somebody just mentioned that there's a 100,000 job gap for cleared individuals and cleared employees. What is the obstacle? Where's the problem where it comes to finding these transitioning service members and bringing them right into the federal fold? Specifically the ones with clearances that continue for a while until it's, you don't use it, you lose it. Again, I have been transitioning for about 6 months out of the military, been retired for about 3. And to be honest, I have not, and I've met many transition veterans that have not had the experience of being approached or even considered for a lot of federal employment, considering my TSSCI is still active. So I'd love to know so where I can speak to other veterans where that gap lies.
So I would love to jump in on that one. Again, used to work for the Chief Talent Management Officer for DoD. This is something that we're trying to get after. So first, call me. I'm the only Love Rutledge on LinkedIn. Please connect with me. That goes to everybody. But I can help connect you with folks who are definitely looking. I think familiarizing yourself with organizations that have high numbers of vacancies, again, I can help you find that. And looking to leverage direct hiring authorities. If you're a veteran, obviously it's much easier to bring you in as opposed to someone who does not have federal experience. So you can use a host of expedited hiring authorities. Other agencies have those, but the Department of Defense has a lot of them. And so there are a lot of ways to get to you. Again, individual hiring managers, they are tired, they are busy. And so we don't have a consolidated recruiting effort in the way you think we would, that would make sense, right? One of the questions that I asked in a previous role is, why are we not as the civilian side, employers and hiring managers leveraging the transition assistance program as a platform to say, hey, you have this particular skill, here are 50,000 vacancies in federal agencies and departments that you should be looking at. And unfortunately, the Department of Labor controls some of those activities and how, by statute, they are providing that information to the Transition Assistance Program. And so that is a known shortfall and a gap that we need to close. And again, I would love to work with you to talk more about that. I think it's also overwhelming for veterans looking at different veteran support organizations because there are so many. So while that seems like an embarrassment of riches, it's also very confusing to the individual trying to find the right fit and the right job. So again, happy to connect you with some resources. There are some specific content creators and veteran support organizations that I think do a better job than others, and happy to connect on that.
Hello. I had a question about where you talked about retention. You had mentioned getting people out that are performing poorly. Do you have any advice on how to do that? Because I find that a lot of times you just keep the same people in as long as they'll stay.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. First, we can't get new talent in. We can't promote middle managers upward who have, some new ideas, right? So if we're hanging on to folks who, even if they are performing well and treating people well, they might not have kind of the fresh ideas that we need to succeed in our various mission sets. First, I would say it's incredibly important for leaders to be vocal about the fact that they will not tolerate inappropriate behavior that creates a toxic workplace. If senior leaders, the most senior leaders in an organization, choose to overlook that in favor of mission accomplishment, you're not going to make any progress. So number one, strategic communication from the top that they will not tolerate that kind of behavior is critical. Second, holding individual supervisors accountable for doing their job as a supervisor. Now, you have to have the right training, as you mentioned before, to be able to do that and be supported in doing that. But if we don't set clear objectives for people and then hold them accountable for those objectives that include leading people, at least in senior executive service and certainly at lower levels as well, if we don't hold them accountable to those objectives that are on the books, then we're missing out on an opportunity. Now, is it very difficult to do this? Is it extremely time consuming? Is it emotionally draining? Yes. But again, if we want to retain the best people, we have to get rid of the worst people. And easier said than done. Again, I hope everybody in this room will help advocate for a variety of civil service reforms that will allow us to do that in a way that is still fair and supports a professional civil service. So again, strategic leadership, being very vocal about it, giving training and support to individual managers who are trying to hold people accountable, and also looking to give new or different opportunities to people who maybe don't want to be supervisors anymore. So often we only promote people who are interested in taking on those supervisory roles when they could be fabulous individual contributors, but maybe not so great managers. So thinking about where we can leverage people's talents for individual contributions where they don't have to deal with personnel issues that might be tripping them up is something we should consider as well.
And one other thing I'll add to that is also understanding the employee relations process. I think a lot of HR professionals, we know that that's a unit, but we do not actually understand what the left and right limits. I think it is a myth, since we're talking about myth busting, that it's really hard to get rid of somebody in the federal government. That's not true. It's hard because there are not things in place, like you're saying, for us to vocally say, you're going to be held accountable now, and documenting how that person has failed the mark for the organization and the employee that they're accountable to.
I still have no idea what time it is. I think we're out of time. Yeah, I'm tired. I don't need a power nap.
10:40.
So you can power nap, you can submit a security packet, you can make a hire, you can check out the graphic recordings, you can take a selfie in the selfie booth. Whatever will fill your cup for the next 20 minutes, but don't forget to come back because I can't lose you. And if you're in the back and you would like a table, there are seats in the front. Don't be scared of the front row. I don't spit that much. Thank you. Thank you, the plant panel. Thank you. Thank you.